You come home from physical therapy on a Thursday afternoon, your knee still throbbing from the exercises, and the first thing you notice is that the garage door is open. The second thing you notice is the dumpster in the driveway, and inside it, unmistakably, is the corner of your husband's old flannel jacket, the one he wore every single autumn for 31 years. Before I tell you what happens next, because what happens next will make your chest tighten in a way you won't forget, I want to ask you for something small. If you believe grief deserves patience, if you believe the people we've lost deserve to be remembered with care, instead of convenience, hit subscribe. This channel is built for people who understand that some things are never just stuff. Now, back to that driveway and the dumpster, and everything it was about to cost you. Your name is Wilhelmina Trask. No, wait, that's already been used before. Let me start again. You are Genevieve Holloway, and you are 68 years old. And for 42 years you were married to a quiet, steady man named Ambrose Kettering, a man who fixed things for a living and never once raised his voice in anger. Ambrose passed away 8 months ago from a stroke that took him in his sleep, so quickly that you didn't even get to say goodbye properly. Didn't get to tell him one more time that he was the best thing that had ever happened to you. Since then, you've been living in the house you shared for 4 decades, surrounded by his tools in the garage, his reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand, his side of the closet still full of the flannel shirts and canvas work jackets he wore every single day of his working life. You raised 2 children with Ambrose, your son, a cautious, image-conscious man named Percival Thistlewood, and your daughter, a sharp-tongued but well-meaning woman named Odalis Fenwick Hart. Both of them grew up watching their father work with his hands, watching him spend Saturday mornings in the garage restoring old radios and clocks, just because he loved the quiet, meticulous work of fixing broken things. You always believed your children understood that about him, that his belongings weren't clutter. They were the physical proof of a man who loved slowly and thoroughly, and without ever needing to announce it. 3 weeks before the incident with the dumpster, you fell on the back steps and fractured your hip, badly enough that the doctors insisted on 6 weeks of intensive physical therapy, 3 sessions a week, each one leaving you exhausted and sore in ways that made even climbing your own porch steps feel like scaling a mountain. Percival offered to help out while you recovered, which you took gratefully, to mean bringing groceries, maybe mowing the lawn. You did not think it meant what it turned out to mean. On that particular Thursday, you'd been at physical therapy for nearly 2 hours, working through exercises with a young therapist named Rosalind, who kept encouraging you gently through the pain. You came home tired, leaning on your cane, looking forward to nothing more than a cup of tea and the quiet comfort of your own living room. Instead, you found your garage half emptied, boxes stacked haphazardly by the curb, and a large dumpster, the kind you rent for a full home clean-out, parked crookedly in your driveway, already half full. You stood there for a long moment, genuinely confused, before your eyes landed on the flannel jacket, hanging over the dumpster's edge like a flag of surrender. Ambrose's flannel jacket, the one with the small burn mark on the cuff. From the time he'd gotten too close to the barbecue grill trying to save a hamburger for Percival's 10th birthday, you dropped your cane. You didn't even feel your bad hip protest as you half ran, half limped toward the dumpster, digging through it with both hands, pulling out not just the jacket but his reading glasses case, a coffee mug with a chipped handle that said "World's Okayest Fisherman," a shoebox of old photographs, and your stomach dropping entirely in the small wooden toolbox his own father had given him, the one Ambrose had kept on his workbench for 30 years, untouched by anyone but him. Percival came out of the house at that moment, wiping his hands on his jeans, looking mildly annoyed rather than remorseful. "Mom, you're not supposed to be lifting things," he said, as though that were the actual problem here. "We were going to be done before you got back. I didn't want you to have to deal with all this. It's just clutter." "Mom, Dad's been gone 8 months. You can't keep living in a museum." You stared at him, at your own son, standing in the driveway of the home his father had built half of with his own hands, casually explaining why he'd decided, without asking you a single question, that decades of your husband's existence belonged in a dumpster. "This isn't clutter," you said, your voice shaking with a fury you hadn't felt in years. "This is your father." "It's stuff, Mom," he said, and there was an edge of impatience now, the tone of a man who'd rehearsed this conversation and didn't appreciate you deviating from his script. Odalis agreed. We talked about it last week. We think it's actually, psychologically, not healthy for you to be surrounded by all his things. The house needs to feel like yours again, not like a shrine. You learned, standing there in the driveway, with your husband's jacket clutched against your chest, that your daughter had been part of this decision too, that the two of them had discussed your grief like a problem requiring a solution, had decided your home needed to be cleared of your husband the way you'd clear expired food from a refrigerator. They hadn't consulted you. They hadn't asked what you wanted to keep. They had simply waited until you were occupied with therapy, vulnerable and exhausted, and made the decision on your behalf, the same way you imagine people make decisions for the very old or the very confused, as though your grief had somehow disqualified you from having opinions about your own home, your own memories, your own husband. That night was one of the hardest of your life. You sat alone in your bedroom, the toolbox on your lap, the flannel jacket draped over your shoulders, even though it was too warm for it, and you cried in a way you hadn't allowed yourself to cry even at the funeral. When you'd stayed composed for the sake of the grandchildren, you felt for the first time since Ambrose's death, truly and completely alone, not because he was gone, but because the people who should have understood what he meant to you had instead decided that your loss was an inconvenience to be tidied away. You thought about all the years you'd spent being the reasonable one, the accommodating one, the mother who never made her children feel guilty, and you wondered, in the dark quiet of that bedroom, whether being endlessly agreeable had simply taught them that your feelings were optional. It was near midnight, still sitting with the toolbox on your lap, that you finally opened it, something you hadn't done in the 8 months since. Ambrose died because it had always felt too much like intruding on something private and sacred to him. Inside, beneath a layer of neatly organized screwdrivers and wrenches, you found a false bottom, a small wooden panel that lifted away with gentle pressure. Beneath it was a stack of folded papers, an old savings passbook from a credit union you didn't recognize, and a handwritten letter addressed, in Ambrose's careful blocky handwriting, simply, "For Genevieve when she's ready." Your hands shook as you unfolded the letter. In it, Ambrose explained that over the last 15 years of his working life, he'd quietly set aside a portion of every paycheck from his side work, the radio and clock restorations he did for collectors, the small jobs he never mentioned because he considered them just tinkering, into an account he'd kept entirely separate, entirely private, meant as a surprise for your 50th wedding anniversary, which would have been 11 months away. The account, according to the passbook, held just under $180,000. He'd written that he wanted you to use it for whatever brought you joy in your later years, travel, a garden greenhouse you'd always wanted, whatever made you feel like the world still had wonder left in it for you. He had never told you. He had never told anyone. It was meant to be revealed on a night that never came. You sat with that letter for a long time. Grief and astonishment tangled together so tightly you couldn't separate them. Somewhere in your chest, something shifted. Not just sorrow anymore, but a fierce, quiet protectiveness over what remained of your husband, over the parts of him that your own children had so carelessly decided didn't matter enough to preserve. You realized with startling clarity that if you hadn't dug through that dumpster yourself, if you had simply trusted your children's judgment about what your husband's belongings were worth, the toolbox and everything hidden inside it would be sitting in a landfill right now, buried under someone else's garbage, gone forever without you ever knowing what he'd left for you. The next morning, you called Percival and Odalis and asked them to come to the house together. That evening, no explanations given. They arrived expecting, you suspect, another conversation about moving forward and letting go. Instead, you sat them both down at the kitchen table, the same table Ambrose had built with his own hands the year Percival was born, and you placed the toolbox in the center of it. "Do either of you know what this is?" you asked them. Percival shrugged. "One of Dad's old toolboxes." "It's the toolbox his father gave him," you said, your voice steady now in a way it hadn't been since the funeral. "The one he used every single day of his working life. The one you decided, without asking me, belonged in a dumpster." You opened it, lifted the false bottom, and placed the letter and passbook on the table in front of them. You watched their faces as they read it, watched Percival's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. watched Odalis press her fingers to her mouth as she read her father's careful handwriting, the same handwriting he'd used to sign birthday cards for her entire life. He was saving this, you said quietly, for me, for us, for our anniversary. And you almost threw it into a landfill because you decided, without ever once asking me, that his things were just clutter. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Odalis was the first to break, tears sliding down her face as she said, "Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know there was anything like this. We really did just think. We thought we were helping you move on." "You didn't ask," you said, and you let the silence after that sentence do the work silence is meant to do. That's the part that hurts most. Not that you were wrong about the money. You couldn't have known about that. But you were wrong about everything else too. You decided my grief was something to manage instead of something to sit with me through. You decided your father's life could be sorted into a dumpster while I was at physical therapy, too tired and too slow to stop you. Percival, to his credit, didn't try to defend himself the way he had in the driveway. He sat with his head down for a long moment before he finally said, I think it was easier for me to throw away his things than to actually feel how much I miss him. If I kept seeing his jacket on the hook every time I visited, I had to keep feeling it. Getting rid of it felt like getting rid of the pain. I didn't think about what it would feel like for you." That admission, more than any apology, was the first honest thing either of your children had said to you since Ambrose's death, and it cracked something open in you. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. Grief makes people strange and thoughtless in ways they don't always recognize. While they're doing it, that didn't excuse what had happened, but it helped you see it clearly, rather than simply as cruelty. In the weeks that followed, you didn't rebuild your relationship with your children through grand gestures or dramatic reconciliation scenes. You did it slowly, deliberately, the way Ambrose had always fixed things, one careful piece at a time. You told Percival and Odalis plainly that you would be the one to decide what stayed and what went from your own home, that grief was not theirs to manage on your behalf no matter how uncomfortable it made them. You asked them to help you go through the remaining boxes together, this time with your guidance, so that you could tell them the stories behind each item. Why the chipped mug mattered, why the burn-marked flannel jacket mattered, why the toolbox, empty now of its secret but full of everything else, would stay exactly where it had always been. On the workbench in the garage, you used a portion of the money Ambrose had left you to do something he'd written about in his letter. You built the small garden greenhouse you'd always wanted, tucked into the side yard where the afternoon light was best, and you spent your recovering months there, tending seedlings, feeling closer to him in the quiet, patient work of growing things than you had felt anywhere since his death. You used another portion to take a trip you'd always dreamed of, to the coast of Maine, where you scattered a small handful of his ashes you'd kept aside, into water he'd always wanted to see and never gotten the chance to. Percival started coming by on weekends, not to help you move forward, but simply to sit in the garage with you sometimes. Quiet, the way his father used to be. Odalis began keeping a small photo of Ambrose in her own home, something she admitted she'd been avoiding because it hurt too much to look at. And slowly you watched both your children learn what you had always known. That grief isn't something to be cleared away like clutter, but something to be carried gently, with room made for it in an ordinary life. You never fully forgot standing in that driveway, watching your husband's belongings sitting in a dumpster like garbage, and you don't think you're meant to forget it. Some wounds are meant to teach rather than simply heal, but you also don't carry it as bitterness anymore. You carry it as proof that you were paying attention when no one else was, that your love for Ambrose was sharp enough and stubborn enough to dig through trash with your bare hands rather than let a single piece of him disappear without a fight. Now, in the evenings, you sit in your greenhouse with a cup of tea, Ambrose's old flannel jacket draped over the back of your chair. Not worn, just present, the way he used to be, present in every room of this house, without ever needing to say much at all. You think about how close you came to losing the last gift he ever gave you, simply because the people who loved him best didn't know how to sit with their own grief long enough to ask you what mattered. You are 68 years old, and you have learned, in the hardest way possible, that love leaves behind more than memories. It leaves behind proof, hidden in the quiet places, waiting for someone patient enough to look. What looks like clutter to the grieving Eyes of others may be the last quiet gift of a love that never stopped working to provide. Look closely before you let it go.